Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to go over and review Puerto Rico and Cuban Americans in our textbook, Latino Politics by Lisa Garcia Bedoya, moving from the initial chapter on Mexican Americans and political incorporation, as we're thinking about these groups as you're moving towards your exam. So in Puerto Rico, as we know, becomes a colony of the United States, right? But we want to see how this identity and history has grown and situated the experience of Puerto Ricans within other racialized groups, namely where we began. Remember that concept of racialization from Mexican Americans. So how does it fit? How do they fit? And explain the changes in early and contemporary Puerto Rican grassroots activism. So I've also posted this PowerPoint so you can go through it yourself, but just to provide a map in the Caribbean, and here's the island broken up with the provinces. This is one of the colonies that the United States took control over after the war with Spain in 1898, where they acquired this territory, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and and everything other territories from that moment. So what we see here is some of the things, just overview of what you read in your textbook. These moments where, namely in World War I, where Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, right? Whether they're born in New York or whether they're born on the island today, and that is a fact that was rooted in the 1917 and codified in the 1917 Jones Act, which gave Puerto Ricans citizenship, right? So 1917, and as we're thinking about what was going on, there was the Great War. So initially, when they were given citizenship, this allowed a pathway now for Puerto Rican males to be recruited into the U.S. military to be sent abroad in the Great War, First World War. So we're thinking about the economic ties. You read about Operation Bootstrap and opening up a free trade, corporate tax breaks, and also the political element of highlighting how American democracy can be imposed upon others, right? So I've already gone over some of this stuff, and what we're noting, and as I mentioned before, in a similar case to Mexicans being incorporated into the U.S. empire, similar to Puerto Rico. And this is what Ramon Grosfoguel calls Puerto Ricans are colonial migrants, right? So they were colonized, and then now they are brought into the U.S. empire. And how have they been marginalized or situated again to what scholars codify and articulate as a second class U.S. citizenship, right? So this is where we're moving. And when we're linking to this moment of anti-blackness and we're trying to situate Puerto Ricans within that, we see the similarities with the way treatment, the Jim Crow treatment and the laws that were applied to African Americans and also to Mexicanos in the Southwest, all right, with segregation and discriminatory laws and housing and education and in every aspect. And we see here the cumulative wealth, the median home income for American families, and the stereotypes that are portrayed. And here's a link if you'd like to see the infamous or famous West Side Story. And you have the link there on the PowerPoint if you'd like to see that. So how have this negative experience really impacted uh, Puerto Ricans? And you've read through a lot of the text, and you've also read about Pedro Albizu Campos, who was a nationalist hero imprisoned in the United States for his fighting for independence for Puerto Rico, and the different groups, right, that begin to form and become politically activated and really move and situate Puerto Rican politics here in the United States within the empire. So we know there is no one Boricua or Puerto Rican movement. There are various movements, just like the Chicano movements of the 1960s. There are many movements within that, just like there are many movements today. Um, And here's a poem you can read through. It's very powerful. And then here's a picture you read about Lolita Lebron, who opened fire on U.S. Congress in 1954. And she says, "No vine a matar, yo vine a morir," for independence, right? To fight for that freedom that Puerto Rico is yet to live out. So, and Fan, you're listening to somebody we had hosted at DVC last year, last academic year. It was Oscar Lopez Rivera, who was in prison for 36 years for taking up arms, for taking up a militant strategy towards independence to be free. And for that, he was labeled a terrorist, right? So these are, and we put that in quotes here, because who is the terrorist? Is it who has the power to label one who seeks their freedom as terrorist? And here's some more on las Fuerzas Armadas por Liberación Nacional. Um, and I'm going, and here's some of the outcomes, right, that we're thinking about and moving towards contemporary moment with post Hurricane Katrina. I mean, Maria, I'm sorry. Speaking of, but I want to move now to Cuba. And Cuba, again, in this moment, and if we're looking at how there's a relation to American politics, it's been very essential. Cuba and Cubans and Cuban Americans, very central to United States politics, are going to be very huge right now in this moment as we're thinking of the electoral politics. Cuban Americans are part of that, what we call the Latino electorate or the Latino vote, which tends to vote very conservatively, supportive of the Republican Party traditionally, post 1959. So our eyes are on Florida right now, and to understand why that ideologically, why a Latino group was racialized as other and uh, called criminals and rapists and lumped in with all these other groups are still akin to vote for a party that seems to not be in their favor. Well, with foreign policy and the linkage to an anti-Castro stance post 1959 and class and educational differences with other Latinx groups really situate Cuban Americans apart from that kind of formula. And again, there is no one Latino vote where everybody votes the same, but Cuban Americans arrived with a higher level of education, with more money in the bank, so to speak, and were given lots of support by the US government in order to, with the goal of overthrowing the new revolutionary leadership led by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and others after, who had thrown out the US capitalist and those who owned the island at the cost of the many. So, as we know that Cuba was again incorporated in that 1898 war and the acquisition of these territories with Spain, the Platt Amendment. So the Platt Amendment that you read about, right, and in Article 3 of the Platt Amendment, it states that the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, and for discharging the obligations with respect to Cuba imposed by the Treaty of Paris on the United States, now to be assumed and undertaken by the government of Cuba. Simply put, the United States will allow Cuba to write a constitution as long as it doesn't intercede with any U.S. interest or anything, and it allows the United States to step in at any time that it deems necessary, right? So this is to have Cuba on its knees, as it is depicted here, with Uncle Sam holding a chain to the Cuban people and giving them a to-do list. This is how it was in practice, and this consequently leads to the antagonisms and the overthrow of the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista by Che Guevara, Castro, and others, and the successful Cuban Revolution, right? Which leads to here, which is launched coincidentally from Mexico. Once Castro, after the failed Moncada attack in 1952, is is imprisoned, is released, flees to Mexico, where he meets up with Che Guevara, and here they go. They sail back from Mexico to Cuba on the famous ship, the Grandma, and lead a successful revolution, right, to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator here, who had sold off the island before the successful revolution of Castro. 90% of the island was foreign owned, dire poverty. So the Cuban Revolution drastically improved the lot of Cubans, except for the capitalist class, right, which then fled to Florida, namely Miami, and are now going to be a prominent players in on next week's election. So when we're looking about, as I was mentioning, these disparities in class, education, and race among the various waves, there's no typical Cuban refugee, right? And some even question whether the terms refugees and exiles remain appropriate descriptors of the Cuban immigrant community. Because as I mentioned, many arrived here as very affluent. Those who fled the Cuba of the early 1960s. So just to give you a glimpse of the number of Cubans in the United States, here you have it in 2000, you see the U.S. born, and in 2017, you see the latest number moving in over 1 million. So very prominent and influential geographically located and in Miami, as I mentioned. So as we're thinking about these chapters and how you're responding and thinking about the incorporation of Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans into this idea of the Latinos in the United States, we already see multiple differences, but yet lots of similarities. And as we're thinking about their political activities, we see again similarities but also discrepancies, right, with Cubans and Cuban Americans right now being tending more towards the conservative lot, but that is changing with the younger generations, right, where they are no longer beginning to identify with their parents or their grandparents as staunch anti-Castro Republicans. Now they tend to be more progressive or open-minded or liberal in their party identification, and that's going to play itself out next week as we see. So I hope this overview assists you in thinking about these groups and the differences. And there's um, lots of rich detail and evidence in Lisa Garcia Bedoya's account, and I hope to see that incorporated in your writing and into your exam. So that'll be it for now, and we will look forward to your reading your work.